So the definition that we're working with of public childcare really is a childcare service that's owned and operated by a public or a state. It's owned by the state government, and the entity could be a municipality or a municipal type local government, a school board or a school authority, or an Indigenous governing body. That's our working definition, and we may have some questions about this, and we're not defining owning what in this particular case, because I'm sure that will come up. So, how does this fit in Canada? How does publicly owned childcare fit in Canada? Well, beyond our borders, in other countries, and you'll hear this from Merit, in countries with mature childcare systems, public childcare predominates. The bulk of the childcare is public. In virtually every instance, there is some for-profit and some non-profit provision. In some places it's growing. There's a lot of back and forth on this, but I don't think there's a country that has a well-running childcare situation that does not have predominantly public childcare. Historically in Canada, there has been very little public childcare. And some of that, I think, is merely historical. I mean, I don't know if anybody's ever looked into why that is. It's not the norm or the default, actually. So the first thing that people think of is not public childcare. Now, that situation of not having predominantly public childcare is shared by all of the liberal welfare regimes. You can think of them as kind of the Anglo-speaking countries generally, the US of A, the Australia, New Zealand, including the Netherlands actually, but they're not an Anglo country. But what they all share is that all these countries use market childcare models. So what could it look like? What does it, what could it look like? What can it look like? So we have in Canada municipally run childcare. We have several managers of municipal childcare departments with us today who will probably make some contribution to this. It could be a municipal entity. Municipalities in some provinces are much smaller than others. In Ontario, they've been amalgamated into sort of larger kinds of units for administrative purposes. So that is generally the main mode of public childcare in most countries, is something, local government. You can also have school authorities. So Julie Sear actually runs the childcare in the Ottawa Carleton School Board. So we don't mean kindergarten, and we don't just mean that it's hosted. It's run by the school board. And that's not common. There's some of it in British Columbia. There's been some more, but it's not common. It's not even allowed in some provinces, I understand. Indigenous governing bodies, and by this we don't mean that a friendship center houses a nonprofit center. It means that the First Nations or the Inuit governing body owns the childcare, runs the childcare, and that's what the childcare that Bonnie Traverse is going to be talking about is in that category. But it could be a local health body, for example. I think in Quebec in the old days, there were local health units that actually ran childcare. I don't believe there are anymore, but there was a period of time where there were quite a few. And you could have new entities that we don't have now that are public or quasi-public. The best example I can come up with was the one that Jane Beach and Kathleen Flanagan proposed in the Manitoba Childcare Commission of, I think it was 2016, which was a kind of a local childcare council that could be constructed. And that's something we don't do, but it's something we could think about. There's no reason not to think about it. So when we're talking about ownership, I just want to make really clear that there's ownership of the childcare, who delivers the childcare, but there's also an important public management function that municipalities in a lot of countries are the entity that actually does the public management of childcare. In Canada, that would only be true in Ontario, where it's a mandated responsibility to actually, for the local they're now called SSM, to actually administer all the money, make a lot of the decisions. Like a lot of the decisions are made by municipalities in Ontario, and those are delegated from the province. But that's not true anywhere else in Canada, although there are some municipalities, particularly in British Columbia, that have started playing that kind of role. And Rianne is going to talk all about this. So the symposium is mostly about the ownership of childcare, but the second issue of public management of childcare is definitely going to arise, particularly with regard to municipalities. So I think this panel, one of the things that this panel will bring is the assets that public childcare can bring during this period of implementation of CWELP when we're charged with expansion. Well, the first, is spaces. We really need not-for-profit spaces, and one of the things that can deliver those are municipalities or school authorities or First Nations governing bodies. Those would be public childcare. The other thing is that, and the OECD talks about this, is that when things are closer to government, they're better, you can steer them. You can say, we know from our planning that this is not exclusive to public childcare, but it's close to government. We need infant care over here, and we're going to put it there. It's kind of a steering function, like how do you get what you want out of it? So I don't want to make that exclusively public, but it is a good way to do it, more public management. The issue comes up a lot of the ownership of facilities. Who owns the childcare building, especially if there's capital money from government that pays for it, or money is paid through other funding that is used to buy a building or renovate a building, own the building. This comes up a lot with regard to for-profit childcare. Who should own that? Who should own that building? And we've been seeing increasingly, I see this all the time, is that childcare can be built on public land, actually, and there's a lot of public land, and it's a kind of decision, it's a kind of a management kind of decision. People say that a public childcare can bring economies of scale, and that's definitely true. It's not the only ones who can bring economies of scale, but it's definitely true with a municipality or a school board. We can see that purchasing and training and all kinds of things, professional development. Public services tend to be stable. This, again, we're talking local government when we're talking public ownership. We're not talking about it, as some of the childcare opposers always talk about, nationalizing childcare and that Ottawa is going to be running all the childcare centers, which, as we know, is completely ridiculous. But there is the concept of subsidiarity, which means that things should be run at a level that is the closest to the people that it's intended for, and that would be local. That local is important. And I've even had people on the right say this to me, that this is a very important aspect of government, that it should be close to the people. So in reality, what we now have in childcare is what you call a mixed economy. We have public funding. It's going into the little bit of public childcare that we have, not-for-profit childcare and for-profit childcare. We'd like our mixed economy really to look like public and more not-for-profit childcare, and but we think that the for-profit childcare is going to be with us for some period of time. And the task there is to talk about, what does that look like altogether? So that's the overview for the